Hi, I'm Chuck Dorsett for Weaver Leather Supply. Let's work on a project I've been wanting to do for years. Old St. Nick, he always goes all out for us. Let's return that favor. All right, so anything I use in this video, weaverleathersupply.com, or check below. We've got links there, going to take you straight to the website. Also, if you want to know when our videos release, just click your notifications. You'll know exactly when these come out. So let's step over to our pattern table, get started. This is a great project. Let's have fun with this one, but right off the bat, I have to apologize. Yeah, my glove had a hole in it. We know how that goes. Anyway, we've got some great videos on measuring out our belt blank. So we're gonna concentrate more on our design. But our belt blank, just in a nutshell, here's what we're doing. I'm gonna take my waist size and I'm gonna add 9.5 inches. Here's how that works. So for me, I'm a 35. So from the center of my oblong to my second hole, that's my waist size, 35 inches. The 9.5 is simply the distance from that hole out and from my oblong out. That's all we're doing. So let's jump over to a digital pick. So on our oblong end, we're gonna come in 1/2 of an inch from the end and 1/2 of an inch from the edge. Now we've got a larger buckle, so let's give that a 3-inch spread. Then 1/2 inch from the edge and 1/2 inch from the edge. Now on our tongue end, I'm gonna come in 3 inches. That's because even if we're on that last hole, our tongue still has room to go through the buckle. We're gonna give each of these holes a 1 1/4 inch spread. Now for Santa, I typically go 5, but let's go 6, just in case Santa has an extra cookie or 2. Now for our decoration, this is the easiest way to do this. I'm gonna find my center point between my inside size hole and my rivet holes. There's my center line. We're gonna work in 4-inch increments out from there. So it doesn't matter how large our belt is, everything's gonna match up and we're always gonna have a consistent distance from our last design to our holes. Okay, now the last point here, English point. I don't have a 2.5 inch wide English point. So all we have to do, let's take a piece of poster board or paper, cut it 2.5 inches wide, fold it over, and then we simply use our French curve and we have a perfect template for an English point. All right, so easy enough here. Let's jump over to our main table, cut some leather. Once we determine the length of our blank, we can make a short, simple pattern. All we have to do, scoot to one end, mark our rivet holes, scoot to the other end, mark our size holes, and it's gonna be perfect every time. For me, I'm a 35-inch waist, so I'm gonna add 9.5 inches to that, 44.5. Actually, let's just bump up to 45 because we've got a little bit thicker leather here, and we're gonna talk about that. I might even, for Santa, bump up to 46 simply because he's gonna be wearing a big, thick winter coat. Now, our leather. If we're gonna stamp a belt for Santa Claus, let's go with our Weaver Select Natural Strap. I love this leather. Let's go with the best that we can. Now, when we're cutting, we need a 2.5 inch wide strap. So we could certainly mark with our awl or a pen and then cut between the two. But I would suggest, let's make a mark with our knife. Press that in because that's going to be an extremely accurate mark. Well, we don't have to go that route because we've gotten the wooden strap cutter. So I'm going to set that at 2.5 inches wide. Watch how easy this is. Well, there we are, perfectly cut. Let's double check this end to end. Look at that, spot on. This is one of the most useful tools in our shop, but in my opinion, the best tool for the money in our shop. Okay, so let's trim to 45 in length. We've got that. Now, this is our pattern sheeting. Makes a great pattern, but also right here, if I use my poster board to make my template for an English point, I can just transfer that right over to my pattern sheeting and I can trace from there. So let's start right here. I'm going to trace in my English point and mark my size holes. Okay, we've got that. So let's just scoot to the other end. Now down here, I'm going to mark for each of my rivet holes. But also, right in the center of this pattern, I'm going to drop in a small hole and I'm going to make a mark. Therefore, when we drop in our oblong, that's kind of a spread and it's a wider belt. It's going to be hard to get that well centered. That's going to make that super easy. Now, when we jump over to mark for our decoration, I'm going to start right here at our rivet hole and at 32 inches, okay? So let's take another pattern, 2.5 inches wide, and I've simply marked in 4-inch increments. So 32, half of that is 16. Let's put our center line right there. Now, with these marks, I don't want to make these too heavy. This is going to be our snowflake, but we need to know right where that's going to be. Now, we can add one more star on either end. So let's square that. I can see my mark. There we are. There's 4. Let's do one more on this end. And 4. Now we're going to drop in a smaller snowflake in between each. So right here on the end, we'll need to come out 2 inches, then center these. Here's the easiest way to do this. We can always mark this on our pattern if we want, but let's just offset that. 2 inches. Now here, let's make as light a mark as we can. And one more outside of our last snowflake. Okay, so let's trim our end. Well, that actually looks good. Now let's step over to our punch table, knock in our round holes and oblong. Let's start with our rivet holes. Now I want to go with a smaller hole here because a smaller hole is going to mean a better bite for our rivet. I'm going to go with a tube that's about 1/8 of an inch or somewhere around 3 millimeters. So let's hit these 4 holes. Good, we've got those. Now for our oblong, I typically want to go 1.5 inch, but we've got a wider belt, bigger buckle. Let's go with a 1 3/4. Now, if we don't have that, it's a little bit of an obscure size, we can always step out our oblong. So we've got a small hole right here. What I'm going to do is I can actually see that hole through my oblong. Let's do our best to center it, both left and right, top and bottom. There we go. We've got a good, clean, straight oblong. Now, down on this end, let's go with a bit larger hole. Let's make it easy on Santa. Let's go with a 1/4 inch, or about 6 millimeters. We're going to hit 6 size holes. And one more. Well, that looks very good. So let's step back over to our main table at our groove line. Then let's case our leather. Before we case our leather, let's go ahead and add a groove line in. That's going to give us a good guide for our border stamp. So all the way down and all the way back. My groover, I've got this set at 1/8 of an inch. Good, we've got that. Let's reset here, case our leather. Technically, we don't have to case our leather. We can simply wet it, give it about 15 minutes, and then stamp. Well, we've got a video on this, and you'll see the difference night and day between simply wetting our leather and casing our leather. Well, first off, we're going with a quality leather. Secondly, we're making a belt for Santa. Let's go all in. Now, I could simply curl my belt up and soak it in the water. Well, to me, that's a little bit inconsistent. So what we're going to do, let's drag our belt through the water. But I want each section to get about 8, maybe 10 seconds of time in the water. So let's just drag this through very slowly. And there we go. Now, some folks that case say they'd like to leave the leather in there long enough for the bubbles to stop. Well, if we give it about 8 or 10 seconds, we drag this through slowly, that's going to happen. So now we've got a good moisture content. Let's give this about half an hour. We're going to let that water wick in, but we're also going to let some of that excess water evaporate out. Our belt looks good. I can feel it. It's got a good water content. Now down through here, maybe up here, seems a little bit drier. That's okay. When we case this, the water's going to wick through this evenly. Now, some folks will roll this up, put it in a baggie. I have a hard time keeping it consistent, so let's go the easy route. Let's take a piece of pattern sheeting. Make sure we don't have any debris on that. Let's lay that down. Let's drop our belt in. Take a second piece. There we go. Lay that down. Good. Now I'm going to take a piece of scrap suede. You don't have to have scrap suede. A towel will work nicely. But what we're doing is we're pressing down on that upper piece of pattern sheeting, but also we're protecting this from light fading. So now I can pretty much put this anywhere in my shop out of the way. So let's give this 12 to 24 hours right where it is. We've given this about 12, maybe 14 hours, basically overnight. Now, obviously, casing our leather takes a little planning. We can leave it cased for up to about 3 days. But the problem is, anything after that, we're going to get a little mold. So if we know it's going to be a little bit before we can get to this piece, let's add just a dab of mouthwash, or maybe say dish soap to the water. That'll keep it much longer. But this looks good, very consistent. So I'm going to leave this for about maybe half an hour, maybe 45 minutes now, because we want this to start to return to its original or natural color. That is just right. Now we need to monitor this. Again, we want this to start to get back to its original color, but I can feel it. It feels moist. It's got some good weight to it. This is ready to stamp and tool. Let's jump over to our punch table, drop in our design. And now the fun part, let's add our design. But here we've got to pay attention, because on our outside mark, we're going to drop in a single geometric, our snowflake there. Then we're going to hit every other mark. So let's make sure we pay attention with that. So we're going to start with this tool. Makes a nice snowflake. So let's do our best to hit that mark right on the nose. Look at that impression. That's our cased leather, okay? Again, let's pay attention. I'm not pointing fingers here. I've done this so many times. Let's skip and drop in on the next. And again, let's do that all the way down. Okay, looks good thus far. Very clean, crisp impression. I can see every detail in that tool. Next up, we're going to go with what actually creates a braid. So there's our design. There's our snowflake. Here's how we're going to do this. So we've got a center point. Okay, so we've got that in. Now I'm going to turn this to where this smaller, shorter line sinks right into that edge line. Let's do it again. There we go. There's our design. Now I botched it a little bit there, but we're going to take our time and pay attention over here. So on our first mark, what I'll probably do is I'll make my one stamp on each, then I'll start again, do my second, just so I'm not trying to turn my belt around constantly. Now, one point, we're going to add a border stamp in here. So notice our smaller point on this. I'm going to point that directly up, and I'm going to put the point of the tool right on our center mark. There we go. That looks good. I'm going to work my way down. Okay, that looks good. Now we're doing it this way. We can do these one at a time, but we're going to be turning our belt around. And I don't want to turn this too much unnecessarily, because there's always a risk we can ding our belt. So now let's turn this out. Good. Now again, the short side, the short straight side, I'm going to drop that right in on that straight line. There we go. Well, that looks so good. Very happy with that design. Okay, last step. Let's do our border stamp. Now, this is a basic floral stamp. I love this. Very old school. There's a left and a right, or a 1 and a 2. I've got these marked. Now, we could always do one, take the other and flip it around, one and flip. But if we only have one, or the budget only says we have one, let's just use that. So down here, let's just go blue out. Keep our stamp there. I'm going to come in about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm going to scoot this over just a little bit. Start up this edge just a little so our two stamps don't clash. Very nice. I love the cased leather. That looks good. Very happy with that border stamp. So I'm going to stamp all the way down to just short of our rivet holes. As we get down to our rivet holes, let's go ahead and stop right there. We could continue to the end, but notice how close we are to that hole. So when we set a rivet, it's going to cover up part of the stamp. But boy, that looks good. Okay, let's jump over to the other side. Let's flip the tool around. So now tape to the inside. And let's start right across from there. And one more. There we go. Now, are my stamps perfectly even and a perfect distance from the edge? They absolutely are not. But first off, no one's going to see that but us. But secondly, we're going to dye this in black. That's going to cure a lot of ills. But all told, I think that looks great. So now let's give this about 10, maybe 12 hours overnight to dry. We're almost done with this beautiful belt. We've given our belt plenty of time to dry, and this looks good. I've got one light stamp there. Gonna make me crazy. But we're going black, so it's not gonna be an issue. Last thing we need to do before we dye, let's bevel our edges. I'm gonna bevel both front and back. So when we dye this, we're gonna round and slick those edges. It's gonna look good. Now we're gonna go with an 8 to 9. So let's go with a number 2 edger. Our back will never edge as easily as our front, so sometimes we have to work it just a little bit, but that is fine. Very good. Okay, let's reset here at our dye. Before we dye our belt, we need to talk about this, rub off. This is an issue, and we don't want this rubbing off because anyone that's wearing our belt is going to be wearing this on some costume. Very expensive costume, possibly. Well, unless we know the real Santa. He's been to my house a number of times, but we've never actually met. We could always simply dye the face, but we're going to have to dye our edges. What's going to happen is that dye is going to wrap around. It's going to look very unprofessional, or at least in my opinion. The second way, and the best overall way to go, let's simply line this. But if we don't have a heavier weight machine, we're going to have to hand sew this. Worth every minute. But let's do this. Let's simply go with our Pro Dye. Lowest risk of rub off, in my opinion. But secondly, we're going to add a good top coat, and we're going to pay special attention to our edges and our flesh side. Now, when we dip dye, it's going to use more dye. But you'll notice, we're going to have dye on nothing but our belt, our gloves, and our paper. So let's run this through our dye. We could go much faster than we can when we're trying to case this. So let's let some of that excess dye drip off. Good. Now let's lay this out with a rag. Let's just take care of some of that excess dye. Well, that looks good. Okay, so let's give this about 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours on a standard day, regular humidity. In that time, I'm going to clean this up, then we'll add our top coat. We've given our belt ample time to dry, so let's add our top coat. But before we do that, we mentioned we're going to do everything we can to keep this belt from rubbing off. So before we go over to our top coat, let's take a rag, and I keep this in my shop in a baggie. This is very lightly oiled. We're just cleaning our leather. Now with our dye, the dye stuff in a Pro Dye has an oil base. Well, now we're going to add just a little bit of oil. But I mentioned this, very lightly oiled, because I don't want this to pool on my belt. We're more cleaning than anything. So let's just rub our top grain. Now let's go to our edges and let's rub these very well. There we go. Okay, now jumping over to our back, let's clean this as well as we can. Okay, that looks good. Now on our rag, notice where we got the most rub off on our edges, but this is ready to top coat. So let's take 2 rags. I'm going to use one to apply, one to buff. We're going to go with our leather balm. So let's get some leather balm in our rag, but we want to add this sparingly. Good. Now let's slowly work our way down our belt. Now the one thing with this I don't want is streaking or bubbles. Those are going to stand out. But now that we've hit our top grain, let's come back in and see if we can get some of our leather balm back down in our designs, our stamped areas. And that looks good. Okay, so let's just buff off some of the extra leather balm. Good. Now let's start at this end. Let's roll this over, and we're going to buff this lightly. There we go. We've got a little distance. That's looking good. And let's go back down the belt. Looking very good. Nice. Next step, let's hit our edges. And we're going to come back down. Now here, let's just wipe off the excess. Good. Now let's come in with our slicker. And I'm going to go with this highest groove. And let's work this down and back. Now, one point when we're slicking, pressure, not the point. I don't want to push this in to where we develop a lip. But let's work this heat and friction. And thus far, we can already start to see and feel that we're rounding our edge. It's getting a good slicked feel to it. So let's go back down and back one more time. And there we are. Now, I don't know if the camera can pick that up, but we've got a good gloss to it. Feels rounded and smooth. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. Our edges are slicked and they feel good. This is a nice belt. Now, one more thing. Let's flip this over. Let's come back in with our leather balm. I can't remember which rag is which at this point, but let's add some leather balm to the flesh side of our belt. We've got our balm on the back, so now let's buff this as hard as we can. And now, in my opinion, I think we've done as much as we can to reduce the risk of rub off. But let's try this. I've got just a white cotton rag. Let's press hard. Well, there we go. We've got just a hint there, but again, we're doing as much as we can. How about our edge? That looks good too. Very nice. Now, our next step, let's drop in a buckle and we're done. Or do we jump over to our pattern table and add one more very cool touch? If you've watched any of our videos, your first thought is, we're going to add spots, and you're exactly right. Let's do this one up for old St. Nick. We've got this beautiful brass buckle. Let's add some brass spots. Now, all kinds of configurations we could go with here, but let's do this. Let's keep it simple. Let's drop a spot in between each of our snowflakes. Well, now we could do this on our pattern, but here's the problem. We've got a 2-inch spread right there from center to center. So if we drop our spot on the 1-inch mark, 1 inch from either side, what's going to happen is that's going to be way too close to this snowflake. It's not going to look consistent. So let's do this. Let's go from edge to edge. That's 1 inch. I'm going to make my mark right there. But also too, let's line this up on our center line. So therefore our spot is going to be an equal distance from either side. So actually let's start right down here. There's our 1 inch, and I'm going to drop in a mark right there. I'm going to do the same thing all the way down. Good. There we go. Everything's marked. Now, to set a spot, we're going to set these by hand. So let's start right here. We're going to go with a piece of scrap. It's a little easier to see than our black belt. But let's say we've got a mark right there. There's the mark where we want our spot. Let's take a spot, and I'm going to straddle that and press the tines in. Good. Now I can see where my tines are. So let's take a small cardboard pallet because we're going to push through this leather. We don't want to ding our blade. Now we want to mimic the shape of the tines on our spot because I don't want more slit than spot. So let's come in from one side, and I can feel that push through the leather. Other side. Now let's flip our knife around. Good. And work that in. That feels good. So let's take our spot, press that through. Nice. It's flush. If it isn't, we can always take this, put it on our pallet, give it a tap. That's going to press that in. On the other side, let's flip it over. I'm going to bend my spot tines inward. Last step. We're not going to hit this hard enough to ding the spot. There we go. So now I can actually feel those tines. They've sunk in. We're not going to snag or grab anything with those. So what I'm going to do to make this easier or a little bit faster, let's take one spot and I'm going to mark all the way down. Then I'm going to cut all the way down. It's going to make it a little bit faster. Yep, that belt needed spots. Okay, let's flip this over, bend our tines in. Now let's be careful because we're using the other end of our craft knife. Okay, let's scoot this back. Now let's just tap each one of these to set that spot and the tines. That looks fantastic, very nice, and I cannot feel the tines on any of those. Just right. Let's jump over to our punch table, drop in our buckle, and finish out this gorgeous belt. We're going with our 2.5 inch wide buckle, so let's load this. Good. Yeah, the wider buckle's a little harder to deal with. So now let's take our medium double cap, and we're going to use our post. And let's let this hang over the edge of our marble here. So this loop has room, and when we set our rivets, we can set those flat. I am so happy with this belt. Let's get a better look at it. We took our time with our stamps. We cased our leather. We did a good job with the dye in the top coat and the spots. They're a perfect touch. I think Santa's going to be happy with that. Santa has been leaving us gifts for years. It's about time we return that favor. And I bet we're never going to be on that naughty list again. I hope your Santa belt is spot on beautiful, and I guarantee Santa is going to love it. Good luck with your projects.